I walked into the bank, holding on to the hope that my savings for cancer treatment were still there. The teller looked at me and said, "Your account is empty. Your daughter-in-law withdrew everything." My son just stood beside her, silent. For a moment, it felt like the floor gave way beneath me, but what they didn't know was that I had already begun gathering proof, witnesses, records, even the lawyer they feared most. And when I sat alone that night, the wedding invitation in my hand addressed only to guest, I realized the fight was just beginning. Follow my story until the end, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, so I'll know how far the truth can travel. The fluorescent lights in the clinic hummed faintly, a sound so steady it felt like it was trying to press the air down on my shoulders. Sitting there in the exam room, the smell of antiseptic sharp in my nose, the doctor's lips moved slowly, and the words landed heavy, one after another. Cancer. The word didn't slam into me all at once. It seeped in, cold and deliberate, filling every corner of my chest. For a moment, the memory of Evelyn, my late wife, washed over me. She had sat in this same kind of room years ago, her hands folded neatly in her lap, hearing her own diagnosis. I remembered her calm smile, as if she had decided even then not to let fear dictate her final days. Watching her fade had been like watching the sun set a little earlier each night, until one morning there simply was no light. I clenched my hands together in my lap, willing them not to tremble. 78 years had taught me one thing: panic doesn't change the truth. My first thought wasn't for myself, but for Damon, my son, and Clara, my granddaughter. I didn't want them to feel the weight I had just been handed. If I could, I'd carry it quietly, the way Evelyn had. The doctor's voice softened, offering treatment plans, options, survival rates. Numbers floated in the sterile air, but none of them stuck. I nodded, giving polite answers, though my mind was elsewhere. It wasn't death that scared me. It was the idea of becoming a burden. Evelyn had worried about that too, and I had sworn never to let it happen to me. When I stepped out into the March air of Cincinnati, the chill cut clean through my coat, sharper than usual. The sky was pale gray, promising rain. Across the street, a young couple laughed as they left the coffee shop, their arms around each other. Life marched on, blind to the fact that mine had just been rerouted into shadows. I drove downtown to the bank. The plan was simple: check the account I'd set aside years ago. That money was for this moment, the treatments, the hospital bills, the quiet dignity of not begging anyone else to cover what life had thrown my way. Evelyn and I had been practical people. We built that fund brick by brick, like the old garden wall behind our house. Inside the bank, the air was warmer, but I couldn't shake the chill. The teller, a young woman with a ponytail, took my card and smiled politely. "Just a statement, sir?" she asked. "Yes, please." She tapped her keyboard, and then her smile faltered, just slightly. "Would you like a printed copy?" Something in her tone made me straighten. "Yes," I said. The printer hummed, spat out a small slip of paper. She slid it across the counter toward me. Balance, $0. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe she had pulled the wrong account. "There must be an error," I murmured, tapping the slip with my finger. "This was supposed to—" She hesitated. "It shows here the funds were withdrawn recently, by the cosigner." Her words stung worse than the diagnosis. I stared at the paper, the ink still warm from the machine. A lifetime of careful saving, all reduced to nothing more than black numbers on white paper. Cosigner. Damon. My own son. Walking back to the car, the world blurred. Cincinnati's early spring was on full display. Dogwood trees budding, children tugging at their mothers' hands, a soft breeze carrying the smell of damp earth. And yet, everything around me felt hollow, as if stripped of meaning. The drive home stretched on in silence. The old Chevy rattled over every bump, each sound exaggerated in the stillness. I passed familiar landmarks. The church Evelyn loved. The park where Clara once chased butterflies, but they no longer comforted me. Betrayal cast them in a different light, colder, emptier. Pulling into the driveway of my modest wooden house, I sat for a long time before cutting the engine. The garden out back, once Evelyn's pride, lay overgrown, the weeds climbing like invaders over her roses. Inside, the quiet wrapped itself around me. On the mantel sat framed photographs, Evelyn in her Sunday dress, Damon as a boy holding up his first baseball glove, Clara with her gap-toothed grin, all reminders of what once was, and of what had just been taken. I lowered myself into the armchair by the window, receipt still in my hand. The numbers stared back at me, an accusation and a warning. The room seemed to echo with Evelyn's absence. For the first time since her death, loneliness turned sharp, almost unbearable. The phone buzzed on the table beside me. A text lit up the screen. Damon's name. "We'll talk tomorrow, Dad. Don't worry about the account. Marla and I needed it." The words tightened around my chest like a vice. Needed it. As if my life, my survival, could be weighed against their wants. The house was silent except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. The receipt crumpled in my fist, and for the first time all day, anger began to cut through the fog. The morning air in Cincinnati carried that damp chill of early spring, when the grass was still more brown than green, and the trees just hinted at buds. The drive to Damon's neighborhood felt longer than it was. Each red light another chance to imagine the words waiting for me. By the time his house came into view, a 2-story brick home trimmed with neat hedges, I felt the weight of that crumpled receipt burning in my pocket. Inside, the contrast stung. Wedding brochures spilled across the coffee table. Stacks of unopened boxes lined the hallway, champagne flutes gleaming under the morning light. Every corner whispered celebration. My son's life, full of new beginnings. My own future, blurred by a diagnosis and an empty bank account, had no place here. Damon opened the door, hair still damp from a shower, eyes darting as if he already knew why I'd come. We stood for a moment without words, until I stepped past him into the living room. My hand brushed against a ribbon-tied package of wedding favors. It felt like stepping into a stranger's home. "I went to the bank," I began, voice steady but clipped. "The account's empty. The money I saved for treatment, gone." Damon swallowed hard, lips parting, but no sound came. His shoulders slumped, and for a moment I saw the boy he once was, caught doing something he knew was wrong. Then Marla entered, carrying a clipboard with color swatches pinned to it. Her tone was brisk, practiced, almost rehearsed. "We used it for the wedding. Ellis, you wouldn't understand. This is once in a lifetime." Her words sliced through the room. My jaw tightened, eyes shifting back to Damon, searching for even a flicker of protest. He stared at the floor, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his silence louder than any confession. "Once in a lifetime?" The words scraped from my throat. That money wasn't a gift. It was my lifeline. Marla smirked, resting one manicured hand on Damon's shoulder as if to remind him of his place. "You've lived enough. This is my time now." For a moment, everything went silent. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, all of it faded behind the echo of her words. The blood pounded in my ears. My fingers dug into the paper in my pocket until it nearly tore. Damon shifted, but still didn't meet my gaze. The boy who once ran into my arms after Little League now shrank into the corner of his own living room, unable to stand beside his father. A wave of humiliation broke over me. Not anger alone, but something deeper, the betrayal of being dismissed, reduced to nothing more than an obstacle in their path to happiness. I turned, unable to give Marla the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. Outside, the air felt colder. Magnolia trees along the street carried their first pink blooms, gentle against the hard truth in my chest. Neighbors tended their yards, waved at one another, their worlds still intact. Mine had cracked in two. The drive back was a blur. At home, the stillness pressed against me. When I sorted through the day's mail, a cream-colored envelope slipped free. My hands trembled as I opened it. A wedding invitation, but not addressed to me, just guest. The room swayed. My grip tightened until the card bent at its edges. That single omission spoke louder than all of Marla's cruel words. The waiting room of the infusion center smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. A television in the corner murmured about the weather, but my attention was fixed on the sign above the doorway. Treatment suites. Each letter felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. My name had been called, and there was no turning back. The hallway beyond was long and white, lit by fluorescent bulbs that hummed with indifference. The nurse guided me into a wide room filled with recliners, IV poles standing like sentries at each chair. Clear bags dripped steadily into tubes that led into the arms of patients who sat quietly, most of them with someone at their side. A woman rubbed her husband's shoulders. A teenage girl scrolled her phone while her mother dozed under a blanket. Everywhere, hands clasped, words whispered, a presence that spoke of love and fear shared. I walked to my assigned chair alone. The cushion sighed as I settled into it, the sound louder than I expected. My coat slid off my shoulders and I folded it neatly across my lap, more for something to do than for order. The nurse, whose badge read Nora Lunsford, gave me a polite smile. It was professional, but kind. The sort of smile meant to make up for what wasn't there. She adjusted the IV pole, checked the machine, and placed a warm blanket over my legs without asking. Beside me, an empty chair waited, angled as though expecting company. Its vinyl seat gleamed under the light, untouched, too clean. My wife would have been there once. She would have filled it with her laughter, her chatter, the little jokes she used to make about hospital gowns. But now it stared back at me, hollow and accusing. "First time?" Nora asked gently, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who had said it hundreds of times. "Yes," I answered, though the word rasped out barely above a whisper. She nodded, clipped the line into place, and patted my arm before moving on to the next patient. I wanted to thank her, but the words stuck somewhere in my throat. Instead, I reached for the baseball cap in my coat pocket. It was a faded cap, navy blue, the brim curved from years of wear. I had shaved my head the week before. Knowing what was coming, better to take the choice from the disease than have it take from me. Pulling the cap low over my scalp, I felt an odd mix of shame and pride. Shame at the fragility now exposed, pride that at least I had chosen how to show it. The IV pump beeped once, then settled into its rhythm. A cold trickle spread up my arm, icy fingers winding through my veins. Around me, conversations hummed in soft tones, laughter even, but none of it belonged to me. My chair became its own island, adrift in a sea of quiet companionship. As the minutes stretched, memories began to surface. I could see her, Evelyn, sitting beside me during routine checkups years ago. She'd squeeze my hand whenever the doctor used words like biopsy or follow-up. She'd keep her eyes steady on mine, anchoring me. She once slipped a peppermint into my palm under the table just to distract me from a long wait. Those small acts filled the air with courage. Now the seat where she should have been was empty, and the silence roared. I stared at the flowers embroidered on the nurse's scrubs as she passed, bright against the sterile white. My mind wandered back to a spring morning long ago when Evelyn planted tulips in the backyard, dirt smudging her cheeks. She had looked up at me then, smiling with that determination of hers. Something to look forward to every March, she'd said. March had come again, and the tulips bloomed somewhere out there. But I was here, tethered to a bag of chemicals. The hours passed slowly, marked by the drip of the IV and the ache in my bones. When Nora finally disconnected the line, she pressed a bandage over the needle site and reminded me to drink plenty of water. Her tone was steady, practiced, yet I sensed a trace of compassion beneath it. As I stood to leave, my eyes caught a flyer pinned to the corkboard by the exit. Bright letters read, "Family Day at the Cancer Center. Bring your loved ones for support and encouragement." Balloons drawn along the edges made it almost cheerful. I reached out, tore one from the stack, and folded it into my pocket. The words burned, Family Day. The parking lot air was cold, the sky a flat gray. Cars came and went, passengers meeting their loved ones with hugs, jackets draped over shoulders. Soft reassurances whispered. I walked alone to mine. "Then I'll do this alone," I murmured, my voice carried away by the wind. The walk home felt longer than it should have. Each step dragged like lead after the hours at the hospital. The cap tugged low over my forehead wasn't just for the chill of March air, it was a shield, flimsy as it was, against the eyes that might notice how tired I looked. By the time I reached the weather-beaten garden fence at the corner of my yard, my chest ached with each breath. The fence was still standing, though the flowers Evelyn once cared for were long tangled in weeds. That sight, more than the pain in my legs, made me stop. It was one of those moments when weariness seeps into more than the bones. It presses down on the spirit. A voice pulled me from the fog. "Ellis, you all right there?" Janice Rowden, my neighbor across the street, stood on her porch, arms crossed against the spring breeze. She'd been widowed nearly a decade, and there was always something gentle yet steady in her tone. I gave a half-hearted wave. "You look beat," she said, already walking down the steps. "Come on, sit with me a bit. I've got tea brewing." Normally, I might have waved her off with a polite excuse. Today, my legs made the choice for me. Soon, I was sitting on her porch swing, a warm mug pressed into my hands, the steam curled upward, carrying the scent of chamomile. "Evelyn always liked this spot," Janice said, settling beside me. "She'd wave when I came back from church, always smiling. She made the street feel alive." Her words dug into the hollow place inside me. I managed a small nod. The tea tasted faintly sweet, though the heaviness in my chest dulled everything. For a while, we sat in a rhythm of quiet sips. Then her gaze shifted, as if she'd been debating whether to speak. "Ellis, there's something I never told you. Maybe it doesn't matter now, but I think you should know." I turned toward her, the weariness slipping into alertness. "It was some years back," she said slowly. "I saw your daughter-in-law, Marla, at the bank. She was with a stack of paperwork. I remember it clear because I overheard her, laughing, almost bragging, to the teller that she was handling assets that weren't hers yet, and I could have sworn I saw your name on the top of one of those forms." The words hit harder than any medicine needle. My fingers clenched the mug until it rattled. I stared at Janice, waiting for her to say she must have been mistaken. She didn't. "She's clever, Ellis," Janice went on softly. "Clever in a way that makes me uneasy. I didn't want to meddle back then, but now, seeing you like this, I think you deserve to know." Silence wrapped around us, broken only by the faint creak of the porch swing. A cold realization settled in. What had happened at the bank wasn't just careless spending, it was planned. She had been circling long before the wedding plans. A strange calm followed the sting. The fire inside didn't burn out of control, it sharpened. I set my mug down and straightened in the seat. "Can you remember what year that was? Any details at all?" My voice surprised even me. It was steady, deliberate. Janice thought for a moment, then nodded. "I keep records, old check stubs, receipts. If I find something with the date, I'll bring it by." That flicker of control I'd lost at the bank began to return, small but real. "Thank you, Janice," I said, the words thick with more meaning than she knew. By the time I got back to my kitchen, twilight was settling. Bills, account statements, and the receipts stamped with $0 lay spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle. I touched the paper, letting the rage flow just enough to harden into resolve. "You took from me once," I whispered to the silence. "I won't let it happen again." A sharp knock jolted me. Damon's voice came through the door. "Dad, we need to talk." My breath caught. The hunter had come to my door, but this time I wasn't walking in blind. The knock at the door hadn't even faded when his voice carried through, uneasy, almost pleading. "Dad, it's me. I just want to talk." The night air was cool, pressing in against the wood of the old house. Letting him stand there felt cruel, but letting him in felt heavier still. After a long pause, the door creaked open, and there stood my son, my own flesh and blood, shifting his weight like a boy caught in the wrong. His eyes couldn't hold mine for more than a second. The silence that followed him into the living room was thick, almost solid. He glanced around, taking in the worn furniture, the photographs on the mantel, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. My house hadn't changed much in 20 years, but the space between us had never felt wider. He sat down slowly, as though the chair itself might reject him. "I'm sorry, Dad," he finally said, voice low, hands twisting together. "About the money. I know it was meant for your treatments, but Marla needed it. We needed it for the wedding. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing." The words hit like stale air, flat, lifeless, without weight. Sorry was easy to say when you didn't mean it. His apology wasn't for me. It was for his own conscience. A bandage on guilt too small to cover the wound. I studied him. This grown man who once ran barefoot through the backyard, chasing fireflies with his mother cheering him on. Now, his shoulders curled forward, as if bracing against his own choices. His voice cracked slightly when he added, She wanted it perfect. Dad, I couldn't tell her no." A part of me pitied him. Trapped, weak, tied to a woman who saw my life savings as decoration for her banquet hall. But pity couldn't erase the rage that burned beneath my ribs. "You took from my life," I said finally, breaking the silence that had suffocated the room. My voice felt foreign, hoarse, pulled from a place deeper than anger. "You reached into the years I have left and you funded your celebration with them." His face reddened. Shame or frustration, I couldn't tell. He stared at the floorboards, jaw clenched. My words seemed to settle heavy on his chest, but still he didn't defend me. He didn't stand up. He didn't shout. He just sat there, hollow, like a man already stripped of spine. Then, suddenly, he blurted out the truth that twisted the knife. "Marla said she'd take care of everything after the wedding. She said you wouldn't have to worry about money, about anything, but only if you didn't make trouble now." The room tilted. The gall of it, my sickness turned into a bargaining chip. My life measured against her honeymoon linens and sparkling wine. She promised to take care of me, like I was some old coat to be hung up after her party was through. "And you believed her?" The words left sharp, each syllable cut with disbelief. His lips parted, but no answer came, just the weight of guilt pressing down, keeping him silent. "You've chosen her over me," I said, steady now, calmer than I expected, a sentence I'd never imagined speaking to my only son. He flinched, shoulders folding inward, like the words themselves were blows. Still, he didn't argue, couldn't argue. After a moment that stretched long and cruel, he stood, his face pale, his hands trembling just enough to betray him. The door's closing was soft, but in my chest it rang like a verdict, final and cold. The house seemed larger with him gone, emptier somehow, though he'd been absent in spirit for longer than I'd wanted to admit. I sat at the kitchen table, the old wood scarred with decades of meals, family talks, and laughter that now seemed like someone else's life. The photograph of his mother stood by the window, light catching the frame. Her smile, frozen in time, felt like a question I couldn't answer. Leaning forward, I whispered to her, my words trembling in the quiet. "I won't let her destroy what's left of us." My hand found the phone, fingers heavy. I dialed a number I hadn't used in months. Harlan Fitch, family lawyer, old acquaintance, a man who still owed me the truth more than once. "Harlan," I said when his steady voice answered. "We need to meet, tomorrow. If you can, it's time." The line crackled, and arrangements were made in simple words. When I hung up, the house was silent again. But inside, something stirred, a shift from despair to resolve. The office smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where serious matters were settled. Harlan Fitch stood as I entered, his hand extended, his eyes carrying a respect I hadn't seen in a long while. He didn't waste words. He didn't need to. The weight in my steps said enough. The chair he offered creaked as I lowered myself into it. The years were heavy on my bones, and the treatment hadn't made mornings any easier. Harlan studied me for a moment before sitting across the desk, folding his hands like a man preparing to deliver hard truths. "I had a feeling this wasn't just a friendly visit," he said quietly. He was right. No cup of coffee, no small talk would ease what lay ahead. The folder on his desk was thick, its edges worn, my eyes fixed on it as though it held the measure of my life. When he opened it, the sound of the clasp clicking free rang louder than it should have. He slid a page across the desk. There, in black and white, were the withdrawals from my medical account. Numbers drained like blood from a wound, each line cut deeper, and then came the signatures. Damon's name, scrawled in a way I recognized but wished I didn't. Marla's hand, neat and sharp, like a blade that had sliced through everything I had built. My fingers gripped the armrest of the chair. Anger boiled beneath the surface. But I held it down, forcing my breath to steady. Betrayal had a way of tightening the chest, making a man feel both old and alert in the same moment. "She did this," Harlan said softly, though there was no doubt in his tone. "And he let her." The pages blurred for a second, not from my eyesight, but from something burning at the back of my eyes. I blinked it away. I wouldn't give them tears. Harlan leaned back, tapping his pen against the contract copy. Each click was a reminder that time was moving. My time was moving. "We have options," he continued. "You could press charges, file for restitution, or we can challenge the signatures. But you need to know, this isn't just a fight with her. This will pull Damon into it." The words sank like stones, dragging my own son through court. How could a father do that? Yet the papers before me proved he'd already chosen his side. Silence weighed heavy between us. I stared at the ink, thinking about the nights I stayed late at the factory so Damon could go to college, about the years Evelyn and I pinched pennies so he'd never feel less than the others. That same boy had let his wife bleed me dry. Harlan watched me carefully, waiting for my answer, but I gave none. Not yet. Instead, I asked, "Secure every record. Keep them safe. Quietly." He nodded, though his jaw tightened. "I'll prepare everything. Just know, once this starts, it may not stop." There was something else in his eyes, something he'd been holding back. He sighed, leaned forward. "I suspected her long before this. I'd seen small transfers, little oddities, but without your permission, I couldn't act. I didn't want to believe she'd take it this far." The room tilted for a moment. To know others had seen the cracks before I admitted them myself. That was its own kind of shame. Still, a strange sense of vindication steadied me. I wasn't mad. I wasn't blind. She had been weaving this for years. I rose slowly, gathering the papers back into the folder. My legs were weak, but my resolve was not. Harlan stood with me, his hand on my shoulder for a brief second, a silent promise of support. Out in the hallway, the light from the tall windows felt harsher than the office shadows. As I pushed open the glass doors to the street, a familiar voice cut through the noise of downtown traffic. "Mr. Riker?" I turned. Nora Lunsford, the nurse from the hospital, stood a few steps away. Her eyes darted nervously, as if deciding whether to speak. She approached, lowering her voice. "There's something about your daughter-in-law you should know," she whispered, her hand lightly brushing my sleeve. The air seemed to freeze. My pulse quickened, though my body felt suddenly heavy. Whatever I thought I knew of Marla's schemes, there was more, waiting to unfold. Nora caught up to me between the rows of parked cars, the late afternoon light turning the windshield glass into sheets of glare. She kept her voice low, the way nurses do when they're about to speak a hard truth. A breeze carried the smell of exhaust and spring rain, and for a second the whole world held still around her words. "I shouldn't keep this to myself," she said. "Months ago, at the hospital, I overheard your daughter-in-law. She was in the hallway by the elevators, telling someone she was redirecting your medical funds to a better use. She sounded proud of it." The word proud stung more than the rest. Nora's eyes didn't shift away. She hadn't come to gossip. She had come because her conscience wouldn't let her turn the other way. "She knew your treatment plan," Nora went on. "She mentioned timing. 6 cycles, maybe 8. Said if anyone asked, she'd act devastated and say the bank must have made an error. She also said—" Nora hesitated, gathering courage. "She said Damon was easy to push when she reminded him how much you'd done for him. That guilt would keep him quiet. The air grew thin. The folder under my arm felt heavier than a cinder block. It wasn't just theft, it was choreography. She had mapped out the calendar of my body and turned it into a budget line. Nora pressed her lips together, as if bracing for me to explode. Anger rose, hot and quick, but it met a wall of old habit, decades of swallowing temper for the sake of peace. The pressure didn't vanish, it compacted into resolve. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said. "I should have told you sooner. I was afraid of losing my job if she complained. People like her know how to make trouble." "You're telling me now?" I said. And that matters. Relief showed in the way her shoulders dropped. She looked smaller then, not because of fear, but because she'd carried a secret too long. I thanked her. I meant it. The truth has a way of arriving late and exactly on time. We stood in the muffled quiet of the lot, traffic humming like distant water. A gull screeched from the riverside of the city, sharp as a tear in cloth. Nora asked if I needed anything. Names, dates, a written statement. Not yet. I told her. Careful steps win long fights. She understood. Nurses often do. The phone vibrated in my pocket, cutting through the fragile calm. Damon's name lit the screen. I answered without moving, the law office rising behind me like a courthouse in the background of a verdict. "Dad," he said, breath already tight. "What are you doing bringing lawyers into this? You're digging into things that don't matter anymore." There was noise on his end, door hinges, the clink of glass. Then another voice, pitched to be overheard. "Marla." "He won't live long enough to fight us," she said. A sunny cruelty poured like syrup. The words landed with a clean, cold finality. On the sidewalk, a couple laughed about something sweet and ordinary. A bus sighed to a stop. The city kept moving, while a son let his wife speak about his father's life like a calendar that could be tossed after December. Damon huffed, trying for righteous. "You're making this worse," he said. "You never liked how we planned the wedding. You never—" Silence answered him better than anything I could have said. On my side of the line, I let the wind and the engines speak. On his, there was shifting, a muffled curse. Marla asking if the call was done. It soon was. I ended it without giving them the sound of my anger to feed on. Back in the driver's seat, the afternoon had tilted toward shadow. The photo of Clara on the dashboard had loosened at one corner, curling away from the plastic. She was missing her two front teeth in the picture, gap-toothed and triumphant, holding a paper sun she'd cut too many rays into. That little face steadied the tremor in my hands better than any pill. This wasn't just about money or pride. It was about the air a child would breathe in a house that rewarded cruelty and called it practical. If I let the theft stand because the thief was family, what lesson would that teach the only part of our line that was still tender? "They won't take everything from me," I said, almost to the steering wheel, almost to Evelyn's memory sitting where the passenger used to be. Not the years I've got left. Not the child who still believes in us. I turned the key. The engine caught. Steady this time. The folder went on the passenger seat, buckled in with the belt as though it were a person who needed protection. I pulled out onto the street, letting the river wind cool the heat in my face, and moved with the kind of care you keep for the last glass left in a set. A gray sedan slid in behind me somewhere near the stadium. At first it was just another car in the flow, but it stayed when others peeled off. It hovered at the same distance through 2 lights, then 3. When I slowed, it slowed. When I took the long way home along the park, it floated behind me as if leashed to my bumper. The longer it stayed, the more measured my breathing became. Better to think clearly than to feel cornered. The city changed around us from office blocks to the old brick homes that had watched families grow and drift for 100 years. I turned onto my street. The maple tree out front shed shadow on the porch steps. The house looked small and stubborn, like an old boxer with one eye still open. I pulled into the driveway. The sedan rolled past, stopped at the curb, then backed up slow until it lined with my yard. The engine idled. The lights went off, but the outline of a driver remained. A head, a hand, a phone held up like a sheet of black ice. No one got out. No window lowered to exchange a casual word. It was the sort of presence designed to be noticed, not explained. I sat very still, the folder under my palm, pressure matching pulse. Scare tactics are cheap when you think the other person has nothing left to lose. The porch boards creaked as I stepped out. The air smelled like wet earth and fertilizer. The neighbors already coaxing their lawns awake for April. The sedan's engine kept its low growl, a purr that wanted to be a threat. I didn't approach. I didn't retreat. The front door opened with the usual stiff protest, and I set the folder on the hall table beneath Evelyn's photograph. The house closed around me in a hush that felt less like loneliness and more like preparation. Out front, the car waited. The clock in the kitchen ticked, an old metronome reminding a musician how to keep time. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it was everything. Either way, the message was plain. Whispers had finished their work. The next act would happen in the open. The invitation had come in a glossy envelope, my name scribbled in Damon's hurried handwriting. A family dinner, it said, hosted at his house on Saturday evening. The words carried no warmth, only obligation. When the day arrived, I ironed a shirt that still smelled faintly of mothballs, slipped on a tie Evelyn once bought me for a birthday long past, and drove through the soft glow of early evening. The house looked more polished than I'd ever seen it. Cars lined up along the curb, laughter spilling from the windows. Yet every step toward that door felt like trudging into enemy territory. Inside, the dining room gleamed with silverware and candles, all carefully staged. Marla floated across the room in a silk dress, smiling broadly as she greeted relatives. She acted as though nothing had happened, as though draining a sick man's account was a favor, not theft. I took a seat at the far end of the long table, deliberately out of the spotlight. My heart beat slowly, but each thud carried the weight of being unwelcome in my own blood's home. When glasses clinked, Marla rose. She held her flute high, eyes bright with pride. "To new beginnings," she announced, her voice lilting, confident. "To the sacrifices everyone has made for our big day." Applause rippled across the table. Some relatives smiled without conviction. Others nodded as though they had no choice. I sat motionless, my throat tight. "Sacrifices," she said. My treatment, my health, rolled into a toast like it was a generous gift she'd earned. She didn't stop there. Turning slightly, she added with false sweetness, "And of course, we just want Dad to be comfortable during our big day. That's all that matters." A few guests turned their heads toward me, their eyes soft with pity, others with suspicion. The kind of look people give when they've heard half a story and assume the worst about the part left untold. Damon sat beside her, nodding mechanically, refusing to meet my gaze. My hands pressed against the tablecloth, holding myself still while humiliation burned across my face. Whispers stirred, faint but sharp. I caught fragments. "Poor man. Must be hard. At least they're including him." Every word cut deeper. My illness had become dinner conversation, a garnish for Marla's performance. Then, from the middle of the table, a voice cracked the charade. "Clara." Her young voice carried clear and unafraid. "Grandpa deserves more than this." The room froze. Utensils stilled. A murmur of discomfort passed among the guests. Damon shifted uncomfortably, while Marla's smile faltered for the briefest moment. My chest tightened, not from sickness, but from pride. In that instant, Clara was the only person in the room who saw me not as a burden, but as the man I still was. Her defense was fragile but powerful, a thin shield against the cruelty dressed as celebration. For a heartbeat, hope flickered through me. Maybe she was the anchor Evelyn had prayed our family would have. But Marla recovered quickly, lips curling into a smirk. "Children don't know the full story," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. She let the words hang heavy, drawing every ear closer. "There are things your grandfather hasn't told you, things better left unsaid." The table leaned in with curiosity, the way people do when gossip promises blood. My pulse pounded as my hand wrapped tighter around my glass, knuckles white. I could feel the room tipping toward exposure, humiliation waiting to be poured out like wine. I steadied myself, staring into the candle's flame. A storm was coming, and I had to be ready. Marla's words hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. "Don't push me, Ellis," she said with a sharp smile. "You and I both know there are things about you that could shift where people's sympathy lies." The room grew uncomfortably still. Forks rested halfway to mouths. A cousin coughed to cover the silence. My heart pounded, not from fear of her supposed secrets, but from the sheer gall of watching her twist the moment in front of family. I forced my jaw to loosen. "If you have something to say, Marla, then say it in the open," I told her evenly. The words came out calmer than I expected, steady in a way that seemed to surprise even myself. Her eyes narrowed. She leaned back in her chair and let out a laugh that cut through the air. "You? Fight me? You won't live long enough to get anywhere with this." Her smirk said more than her words ever could. She felt invincible. Under the table, Clara's small hand found mine and squeezed. I glanced at her, and in her young eyes was something I had almost forgotten: faith. The grip of her hand steadied the ache in my chest. Before Marla could press further, a voice rose from across the table. "I can't stay quiet anymore." It was Janice Rowden, my neighbor, who had been invited by Marla to fill the table with more cheerleaders than family. But her tone now was far from cheerful. She set down her fork and stood, clearing her throat. "I remember," Janice said, her eyes fixed on Marla. "I saw you and Damon at the bank. You both were withdrawing money under Ellis's name. You were bragging about putting assets to better use." Gasps echoed around the dining room. Chairs creaked as people shifted, trying to see if Marla would deny it. The clink of a spoon against a plate was the only other sound. Marla let out another laugh, but it faltered halfway. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving a hand. "She's mistaken. Probably mixing up one old man with another. Banks are full of paperwork, isn't that right, Damon?" But Damon's face had gone pale. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again like he was gasping for air. She told me it was temporary," he stammered. "Just for the wedding. She said she'd put it back." His voice cracked, trembling in front of his own family. The room erupted in whispers. A cousin muttered, "Temporary?" Another leaned in to ask, "Did you really take it, Damon?" Watching my son crumble like that tore something inside me. I wanted to reach out, to steady him as I had when he was a boy. But the truth stood between us now, a chasm that no fatherly hand could bridge. He had chosen to follow her down this road. Silence settled, heavier than before. My chest ached, not only from the weight of betrayal, but from the clarity that followed. Damon was lost to her influence, and I could not save him by carrying his guilt. Suddenly, Marla shoved back her chair. The legs screeched against the hardwood floor. She stood tall, her face hardening into something cruel. "This isn't over," she snapped, pointing a finger at me. "You'll regret crossing me." With that, she stormed toward the door. The slam echoed through the dining room, rattling the glassware. Family members shifted uneasily. Some stared at their plates, ashamed. Others glanced at me with pity. A few, braver than most, offered the smallest nods of support. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. The truth was out now, but the battle had only changed form. This was no longer about whispers at a dinner table. It was about courts, lawyers, and a community that would see who stood on which side of right and wrong. The house was quiet except for Clara's soft voice beside me. "Grandpa," she whispered, "you didn't deserve that." Her words warmed the wound inside me, but deep down, I knew Marla was already plotting her next strike. The whispers began before I even stepped out of my front door. At the grocery store, in the pews of the small church I'd attended for decades, on the sidewalk where neighbors leaned over their fences, everyone had heard the old man's cancer money stolen by his own daughter-in-law. A mix of pity and outrage traveled faster than any car. Some eyes softened when they met mine, others darted away in embarrassment. But the current was clear. Truth had finally crawled into daylight. Part of me felt ashamed to be the subject of such gossip. Yet another part, quieter, steadier, took comfort in knowing I wasn't crazy. that people finally saw what had been hidden behind closed doors. Marla's charm and Damon's silence couldn't drown it out anymore. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and cold stone when I walked in with Harland Fitch at my side. My steps were slow, careful, but inside, every nerve hummed with a strange readiness. Rows of benches filled with neighbors and curious townsfolk. Murmurs hushed when the judge entered. I could feel Marla's eyes on me, sharp as glass. But I didn't look back. Harland rose, calm as always, his voice carrying like a seasoned preacher. He presented Janice Rowden first. My neighbor stood straight, though her hands trembled, and told the room how she'd seen Marla at the bank, Damon beside her, signing away money that wasn't theirs. When the bank records were laid down, stamped and signed, the air seemed to shift. Marla tried to laugh, waving it off as a family misunderstanding, a private matter blown out of proportion, but her laugh sounded brittle, almost desperate. I didn't move, didn't speak. Let the truth stand taller than my words. Then came Nora. The nurse walked to the stand, eyes filled with the same quiet regret she'd shown me in the parking lot. Her words struck harder than any gavel. She testified that I had postponed chemotherapy because the funds were gone, that my health, my very life, was endangered by what had been taken. A gasp rolled through the courtroom. The judge's brow furrowed. It wasn't just money anymore. It was time stolen, strength stolen, life itself stolen. Sitting there, I thought of Evelyn, my wife, and how she would have squeezed my hand in this moment, whispering courage into me without a word. My hand clenched the armrest instead, knuckles pale. Across the room, Damon sat beside Marla, his shoulders slumped, his jaw tight. He never once looked at me, never raised his voice to defend me. That cut deeper than anything Marla could do. Betrayal from blood is heavier. It settles into your bones. Clara, sweet Clara, leaned close and whispered, "Grandpa, I believe you." That small voice steadied me when everything else trembled. When the judge spoke, the courtroom stilled. Marla's actions would face criminal investigation, the bank fraud undeniable. As for Damon, his name lingered in limbo, his choices not yet judged, his silence hanging heavier than chains. Walking out, flashes of cameras burst like fireworks, reporters shouting questions I had no interest in answering. Marla hissed as she passed me, her words venom wrapped in silk. "This isn't the end." I stopped, looked down at Clara holding my hand. Her eyes searched mine, waiting for something, fear, anger, anything. Instead, I gave her the only truth I had left. "It never ends with family," I said softly, steady enough for her ears alone. But neither does the truth. The quiet that settled over my house after the court hearing was unlike any other silence I had known. In the courtroom, there had been noise, voices clashing, documents rustling, whispers rippling through the benches. Here, within these four familiar walls, there was only the echo of what had been lost. Justice, if you could call it that, had its place, but it didn't fill the empty chair across the table. It didn't bring warmth to the rooms where family should have lived. I set my hat on the hook by the door and leaned against the frame, breathing heavier than I cared to admit. The silence carried weight. It reminded me of Evelyn, of nights when she sat by the fire, humming softly while I read. Now, only the hum of the refrigerator dared to interrupt my thoughts. Justice might punish Marla in the eyes of the law, but it didn't stitch together the fractures she had left inside this family. The next day, the front door opened with a rattle. Damon stood there, my son, shoulders tight, eyes avoiding mine. In his hands, a small box, old baseball gloves, a stack of magazines I had kept from his teenage years. "I came to get my things," he muttered. His voice was flat, stripped of warmth. I wanted to reach for him, to ask him to sit, to talk like we used to when he was a boy, afraid of thunderstorms. But the man in front of me was not the boy who used to grip my arm when the sky cracked open. He was a husband now, chained to a woman who had hollowed out the bond between us. "Take what you need," I told him. My voice surprised even me, calm, steady. He nodded, eyes flicking around the room like a stranger searching for exits. No apology, no attempt at mending, just a quiet retreat with the box in his arms. When the door clicked shut, it sounded like a gavel hitting wood. Final, irreversible. Blood doesn't always bind. Sometimes it cuts deeper than strangers ever could. Later that afternoon, Clara bounded up the porch steps, her school backpack bouncing against her side. She didn't ask about court. She didn't mention her parents. She simply came in, laid her notebooks on the table, and pulled out a sheet of paper. "I drew this today," she said, eyes shining. It was simple, a family drawn in bold crayon strokes, a tall figure with a cap, me, a smaller one with pigtails, her, and above us, a sun glowing wide across the page. No father, no mother, just us two beneath the sky. She marched to the fridge and fastened it there with a magnet shaped like a cardinal. "Now it feels brighter in here," she announced. For the first time in days, my chest loosened. "It does," I admitted, voice thick. She leaned against me, and I let the warmth of her small presence stitch together pieces that had been tearing apart. The following morning, Janice Rowden knocked and stepped inside, carrying 2 grocery bags. "You're too thin, Ellis. You can't fight battles on an empty stomach." She unpacked milk, bread, and a roast chicken onto my counter, moving with the ease of someone who belonged here. "Janice, you don't have to—" "Hush," she cut in, giving me that no-nonsense look. "Sometimes family is chosen by heart, not blood. Don't forget that." Her words sank in deeper than she probably realized. Maybe I had lost Damon to Marla's grip. Maybe justice hadn't mended old wounds, but I wasn't alone. Clara, Janice, even Harlan standing beside me in court. They were threads weaving a new kind of family, one stitched not by obligation but by choice. That evening, as dusk painted the sky, I sat at my kitchen table. Clara's drawing on the fridge glowed softly in the lamplight. Then came the mail, a single envelope, heavy with formality, my name printed across the front in sharp, legal script. Hands steady, I opened it. The words struck like cold steel. Marla had filed a counterclaim, accusing me of defamation, harassment, trying to twist the truth into something poisonous. I placed the letter flat on the table, laid my palm against it, and breathed deep. Fear did not rise this time, neither did despair, only resolve. If she wanted a war, she'd have one, but it would be fought with truth, and truth has a patience Marla never understood. The house was still, the night pressing close. I looked at Evelyn's photograph on the mantel, then at Clara's drawing on the fridge. Between what I had lost and what I still had, I found my answer. "If it's war she wants," I whispered into the silence, "it's war she'll get." The courthouse smelled like dust and lemon polish, and the clock above the seal ticked louder than any heartbeat. Marla sat 2 rows ahead with her chin lifted and a fresh coat of bravado. Damon kept his eyes on the floor. When the judge asked for opening remarks on the counterclaim, Harlan rose without hurry, as if setting a fragile cup on a saucer. He did not raise his voice. He let the paper do the work. First came the bank records, clean copies, time-stamped withdrawals, account numbers ringing like small bells, my name, her signature, Damon's co-signature, then the medical notes, the kind that speak in codes but tell a human story, infusion postponed, patient reports inability to pay. Harlan linked the dates like fence posts down a winter road. He called Janice, who repeated, steady as a metronome, what she had seen at the bank. He called Nora, who explained with a nurse's softness how missed cycles don't just bruise pride, they bruise the body. Each word tightened a quiet rope around Marla's narrative until it couldn't draw breath. Marla's attorney tried to reroute it all into family confusion. The judge's face didn't shift an inch. He tapped his pen and asked, "Where's the confusion in these signatures?" No answer came that could stand on its own legs. The pen tapped again, a patient hammer. The ruling landed like a gavel before the gavel. The counterclaim was dismissed as baseless. Then came the part I didn't expect to hear aloud in that room of strangers. Reckless and malicious. Words heavy enough to sink a ship. For a moment, no one moved. A reporter's pen scratched. A bailiff coughed into a sleeve. Somewhere in the hallway, a copier hummed to life, grinding out someone else's truth. We spilled into the corridor. Flashbulbs. Questions. The quick shuffle of shoes on tile. Marla pushed through the crowd. Her wedding day smile curdled into something sharp. Someone asked about the phrase she'd used so often, once in a lifetime. Another voice replied, not mine, not Harlan's. Yes, and this is the one she'll remember. The words hung there, sour and right. Damon stood apart, pocketing and unpocketing his keys. When the judge called us back for restitution, he looked smaller than the suit he wore. The order came simple and firm. Repayment from Damon for a portion of the loss. A separate track for criminal review against Marla. I watched my son's mouth tremble. There was a time those lips asked for water in the night. For a lullaby. A time my hands knew what to do. Today, they found stillness. He turned to me, palms open, the old boy and the man flickering for a terrified second. Words found their way to air before my heart could soften. Son, I said. Money can be repaid, trust cannot. His face went slack, then folded. I did not step forward to gather him, because wisdom and love sometimes mean you let the fall happen. He lowered his head. Harlan touched my elbow. Gentle pressure. The shepherding of a friend. We walked out under a sky the color of cold steel. Clara slipped beside me and took my hand without ceremony, the way a child reaches for a railing on a staircase. You won, Grandpa, she whispered. We both did. The wind lifted a strand of her hair. She smoothed it back like her grandmother used to. Across the steps, neighbors I've known for 40 years paused with grocery bags, nodding as if we'd just finished a long, decent job. Janice came forward with a small smile and a brown sack braced on her hip. Truth may take its time, she said, but it always comes. We did not celebrate. We went home. I made tea in the old kettle with its polite whistle. Clara drew at the kitchen table, talking about spring plays and college scouts in the easy, bright way teenagers talk when they are trying to glue a grown man's heart together. Janice put soup in the fridge, then waved off thanks with the authority of a nurse and a neighbor. When the house was quiet again, the phone rang. A woman from the hospital billing office cleared her throat and spoke carefully, like stepping stones across a creek. The fund, she said, had been reinstated pending the court's documentation. Nora had advocated strongly. Mr. Riker, we have an opening for your next infusion. We'd like to keep you on schedule. I sat down before my legs remembered how thank you seemed smaller than the moment, but it was the size I had. After we set the time, after the line disconnected and the dial tone hummed its thin song, I looked at the refrigerator. Clara's drawing waited there. 3 figures. A bright sun. A garden with comically large tomatoes. The family is smaller on paper than it was in my mind last summer. But the colors are true. And the sun is high. Night settled over Cincinnati like a careful blanket. In the living room, I ran a thumb along the frame of the wedding photograph from another century. My wife in lace we could almost afford, me in a rented jacket, both of us laughing at the cake collapsing. That day didn't cost anyone's medicine. We spent almost nothing and gained a lifetime. Love is rich that way when it is honest. By the window, the street lamp pooled light on the sidewalk where, weeks ago, a car idled a little too long. Tonight the street was empty. I thought of the judge's words, of Harlan's pen, of the nurse's quiet testimony, of a neighbor who listened when it mattered. Betrayal can make a man feel like a house with all the windows broken, wind whistling through the rooms, but you gather glass, you call friends, you learn where to hammer and where to wait. Clara patted in with a blanket and dropped it over my knees without fuss. Big day. Huh, she said, smiling because she didn't want me to try. Big day, I agreed. And the 2 words felt clean again. They thought they stole my life for their one day. But in the end, I gained something no court could grant. Peace, and the certainty that truth, like love, endures.